Hello and welcome to the Politics and Media programme. The British government is negotiating compensation payments to thousands of Kenyans who were detained and severely mistreated during the Mau Mau insurgency in the 1950s. This would be the first compensation settlement resulting from official crimes committed under imperial rule. The British government was defeated in the UK courts after hidden documents were uncovered showing that ministers had been aware that Kenyan men and women were being tortured and killed. Two of the Kenyans demanding compensation from the government were castrated. It's been suggested that this could open the floodgates for other countries to seek compensation for crimes committed during British colonial rule. But critics argue that atrocities committed during colonial times are not the responsibility of the current government. British veterans of the Kenyan crisis also claim that brutality by the Mau Mau insurgents is being ignored. With me to discuss this in the studio is Dan Thier from the Mau Mau Justice Network, Murad Qureshi, Labour member of the London Assembly, who has been a vocal supporter of the Mau Mau compensation campaign, and finally by phone we have Ben Harris-Quinney, chair of the Conservative think tank, the Bow Group. Welcome to the programme, everybody. Dan, could you just explain for us what the historical background to these compensation claims is? What was happening in the 1950s? Many of our viewers won't know.
It is very, very straightforward. What happened is that after colonization for about 60 years, after a period of more or less acceptance of foreign rule, a major war erupted. The preparation for it started immediately after the World War II. The Kenyan soldiers who were in the British Army in places like Burma and India and Sri Lanka were at the heart of organizing the final war of liberation. It wasn't a rebellion, that's belittling it. Mau Mau war, and it wasn't other than a war, was the liberation war that freed Kenya from colonial foreign domination. It was centered above all in central Kenya, but it involved all regions, all ethnic communities of Kenya. Of course, the British government then sent troops from here, Air Force, tanks, artillery, to the country. They also combined the military forces in both in Tanzania, in Uganda, and Kenya into one force, so it can be concentrated in Kenya with a view to defeating the Mau Mau. So it wasn't a little rebellion or local war. Their object was to ensure that Kenya would remain a British colony with a white population, which was a tiny fraction of less than 1% of the population, to control the country. The society was stratified with white people on top, and their jobs only white people could do. And below them were jobs that only Asians, who again a small minority who had been brought to Kenya from India, mainly to construct the railways, because our people were not used to that kind of work.
So some similarities.
And the Africans were right at the bottom.
So some similarities with the apartheid structure.
It was exactly that. It was by law. There was a job that an Indian could not do. And there were jobs that an African could not do. By law, they were classified. It wasn't something that somebody thought up occasion. There was a law which said who could do what job.
Right. So, I mean, we'll come on to the details and the arguments about the compensation in a minute. But I mean, from what Dan said, one thing that this might lead to is a greater understanding of the scale and nature of the liberation struggle, as Dan says, in Kenya.
Indeed, and I think actually here in Britain we're in denial about what imperialism does involve, particularly when we left many of the possessions, so to speak, we had around the world, whether it be the subcontinent or Africa. The reality is it's a dirty business, and I think it's only by the persistence of people from Kenya insisting on getting justice in terms of the Mau Mau rebellion that we've got this far and got the Foreign and Commonwealth Office eventually to admit, and that's what it is essentially, by negotiating now for compensation, that this was what happened. and this is what was done in the name of the empire, not before World War II, after World War II in the 50s and into the 60s. There are actually living British troops, I suspect, who were involved in this. And so it goes much further than people realise. That's why I found myself involved, because there are naturally constituents here in a place like London who are informed about these things, and I'm glad it's informed my appreciation of British history, and something which I think we should readily acknowledge and get to terms with as soon as possible.
Okay. Let me bring Ben Harris-Quinney in now. Ben, I mean, as I say, we'll come on to the debate exactly about the compensation claims, but do you accept that picture of what was happening in Kenya in the 1950s, that we had an essentially apartheid regime and a struggle for national liberation that was part of a much wider decolonisation movement at the time?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think there's still sort of factual information to out on this.
Yeah, keep going, Dave.
But what we've seen in terms of this case is a tremendous releasing of information that otherwise been held by the British government. I think that's a fantastic thing from a historical point of view. It's very important that all of the information is available to historians, so we can truly analyse the legacy of empire and Britain's involvement.
Okay, we're having a bit of difficulty with the line there. So Dan, let me come to you. So what of the documents Ben was referring to them then? What has been uncovered here? What's new, and how did that impact on the court case that we talked about in the introduction?
What actually happened is at the point of decolonisation, there was a bonfire in Kenya. The fires will be burning in all districts of Kenya. The district commissioners and provincial commissioners were ordered to burn the document, as was the government in Nairobi, to erase the evidence. Fortunately for this case, one of the white officers from Britain, instead of burning his files, actually burned other papers and kept the files. So when the case in London came up, to the British government's shock, this good man came up with the documents. That's what forced Britain.
So it's one single set of documents that were
he had because he had a whole set of things. Because as a senior official, he'd be sent copies of everything. So he had a whole file. And that is what enabled the veterans here at the High Court to have their case accepted to be heard at the High Court. And then, as you know, the British government denied that they lost that debate. Then they came with another argument. Oh, this thing happened such a long time ago, it cannot possibly be heard. And then they lost that. And that last battle, which ended in July last year when they lost again at the High Court, was backed by the documents you're referring to, which were discovered here in Britain. And they were not just about Kenya. They were about 37 former colonies. There were over 800,000 files hidden deliberately by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And those documents actually then enabled the second, because the British government kept appealing whenever they lost, they enabled the next appeal to be won by the Mau Mau veterans. Okay, and now then we recommended to them at the end of July to forget the court procedure and to go for a negotiated settlement in July. They rejected it and appealed. And the court was, an appeal was going to before the appeal court. Today, it was going to start. So they were, with that information, appeal from us for them to accept negotiation. From July, they dismissed it until about 2 weeks before the appeal court was about to start.
And now they're
then
in the
they
process.
offered negotiations. That's the history of it.
Okay, let me bring Ben back in. Ben, Do you have a problem with this process? Because I mean, it seems that there's a very clear trail of historical evidence showing the awareness of the British government. They were complicit in what are, in every other circumstance, described as war crimes. Why wouldn't compensation be appropriate?
Well, I think to the first point, I'm very, as I said before, I'm very glad that these files have come to light. I think that there are serious questions that have to be asked as to why the Foreign Commonwealth Office have decided, or up until only very recently, to keep this necessary historical evidence hidden. And I think it's, as I say, I think it's a great thing that the Mau Mau have managed to uncover this and to force via our justice system, the FCO, to reveal these papers. The problem then comes when I think you're looking at compensation and an attempt to monetarize history effectively. Whilst I accept that it's very important to understand our history, and it's very important not only for Britain but for the world, I don't think you can start applying some sort of legal attempt at legal redress to history, because if you do that, you will forever be travelling down that road.
Yes, but isn't the problem with that argument that these are survivors of this? We're not talking about somebody's, seventh cousin twice removed 300 years into the future. We're talking about people who actually experienced this.
No, but there is a question as to where you set that arbitrary line. Okay, you can say, well, the line is that people that are alive today. Well, then we have issues with the Sepoy Revolution in India. What about the bombing of Dresden? Should we be paying compensation to victims of that? This was something that happened in a completely different period of history.
So is your issue with the compensation, but not with the legal process? I mean, for instance, you have no problem, presumably, with Nazi war criminals being tried.
No, I have no problem at all with that. But
so you'll be fine with British officials being tried under the same process here?
Well, I think people at the FCO that have withheld information illegally from the British public as well as anyone else should certainly fall under law, and that should be explored. But where I disagree is this idea of sort of paying financial compensation to members of past members of the British Empire, or those that have been injured or been in some way wrong during what is essentially a military campaign. And that's what it was in Kenya. It was a military government. It was the end of the scramble for Africa, and we can apply again the same thing to Dresden, if you like. People were horrifically injured, but it was injuries sustained during war, and it was a completely different time in history.
Okay, let me bring Murad in. Murad, so what is the case specifically for compensation? And we'll come on to some of the other legal questions in a moment.
Well, I think the main case is that we've still got victims of those appalling events still alive, and I think they are they should have duress, whether it be financial, apology, or whatever else. It should be a combination of things. I, for example, possibly could make a claim on the basis of my grandparents and what my grandfather had happened to him before World War II in the Indian subcontinent. But I'm not going to pursue that because he's not alive. In this case, we have many of the victims still alive, and I think actually the Foreign Office were hoping that many of them would have passed away before they released these documents. Thankfully, they're still alive, and that they've come into the public domain now. Or their existence has. And I think that's the basis. And that is the only way we're ever going to, quite honestly, as a nation, come to terms with what we got up to in the name of the British Empire. We have a lot of fanfare given to it. We give out honorary titles on the back of it, and I think what we need to also look at is what it says about the colonial legacy and what we actually did, even when we were presenting ourselves as willing partners, willing to let go of our colonial possessions. That really hasn't been the case in this instance in East Africa, and I think you'll find that in South Africa as well.
Yeah, Dan, let me just ask you this question. Is the compensation claim based on the fact that what happened to the individuals concerned were war crimes and not simply a sort of process, sort of anybody affected by the war, which seems to be the point that Ben's been making.
It is really straightforward, actually. We are talking about a court case involving 3 individuals. It started with 5 individuals 3 years ago. Because of old age and the torture they went through, 2 of them are no longer with us. 3 are left. At any moment, we could have nobody left in the case. We're talking about 3 individuals, 1 woman and 3 men. Of course, it is clear that the others who had similar experiences but didn't have the resources to mount this court case, who, through the principle of precedence, benefit by having relatively easy way to make comparable claims. It is not a compensation to the country. For example, let me tell you, over 300,000 of our people were killed during that war. The population went down. In a population of 5 million, 300 people were killed during that war, which was about 1/5 population. We're not making any claims about on those. Okay, let me just say one other point, if I may.
Because that's an important point. Let me just put it to Ben. Ben, I mean, you were saying, look, this won't work. Could be applied to Dresden. But the argument here in the studio is really that this isn't a comparable case. Nobody's making a claim about everybody who died during this military operation. They're talking about specific individuals who were treated in a way which is way beyond the Geneva Convention or any known rules of war. Hi, Ben, are you still with us?
And you mentioned Nazi war crimes. Now, what happened with Nazi war crimes is that Germany was not required or compelled to pay compensation, for example, to British people that were held in German prison camps. What happened was individuals were tried. And I think there is a case there, if you're talking about particular individuals that have done things that are above and beyond perhaps their orders or above and beyond what would be acceptable practice in war, going into war crimes. I think you've got to then pursue specific individuals that have effectively abused their position, be it in the military or in a military government, in order to abuse and injure other human beings. So I think you can look at that and pursuing individual people, but I don't think you can challenge a state in that way.
Okay, well let me put that point to the guests in the studio.
You're entering into a world of endless intangible pursuit of challenging the entire British history, French history, German history.
Okay, well let me put those points to Murad. I mean, Murad, would you be in favour of pursuing the course which Ben thinks would be wiser, that individuals who are responsible for these acts, that they're pursued through the courts?
Well, no, I think the state has played a critical role here. I mean, those particular individuals are probably going to say to us, if we put them up in court, well, Gov, I was only listening to commands. And I think there was a head poncho here, the particular ministers and civil servants in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office would have signed this off. And I think that's the trail they're trying to stop us getting at. Let's get real about this. And as for its historical contribution, I can't think of anything better, actually, than discovering this rich source of information to really get to the bottom of a lot of what was the reality of empire. It was only because I went to South Africa during the last World Cup that I realised why the Boers have still got a thing about the English. That's not surprising. We stuck them in concentration camps. So, these kind of things do linger on, and I think we've got to start acknowledging them. And I do think, actually, if those individuals who were actually involved in the torture were put up front in courts right now, I suspect that's what they're going to say. We were only following orders.
And some of the critics of the compensation campaign point to atrocities carried out by the Mau Mau. Do you think that that's an argument that should be taken more seriously or not?
Well, we're talking about a regime, an empire that actually authorized that. The argument we're hearing now, the objection to this, was actually a major item at the court here in London. And for the last 3 years, at every stage, that argument has been challenged, hard and challenged, and lost at court. So we are losing battle that the courts here in London, not in Kenya, have ruled they are not valid. Because this was government policy. It was an individual general or individual brigadier or colonel organizing a thing out. These were clear instructions to do certain things at the top. As for the compensation, even today, the Jews victims of Nazism are still being paid compensation. That was 10 years before Mau Mau. The British prisoners of war in Malaysia, under the Japanese in Malaysia and places like those, to this day, and again that was 10 years before Mau Mau, are still receiving individual compensation. So it's not an old case. The older case, I can cite many more. So why not Kenya? Is it because we are Africans?
Okay, let me put that point to Ben. Ben, what Dan's saying is, look, there are other cases of compensation here. So why should some groups be compensated but not others?
Yeah, I think that is really the point I would make, that there are a wide range of cases, not just in Kenya, not just in Africa, but the entirety of the world, really, where you can apply exactly the same questions and cases to all of those individual incidents. And the problem with that is, I think you take advantage of what is a very fair judicial system in the United Kingdom, and let's remember that it's, as has been said, it's by the British justice system that this has been pursued. It's actually likely that because of the extent of all those cases, if people or if individuals involved are deciding to pursue this with a view to fiduciary gain, there is a great danger that actually further legislation will have to come forward, as it has in the past, to say that no claims could be made on anything that happened before 1954. That might have to be extended, because I think the British justice system is there to pursue justice, to find the truth, but it is not there to sort of pursue claims throughout the entirety of our history, which are highly debatable, and then pay out sums for the British state, which had very little, if not no, connection to those things that happened then, now, and that's not the function of the British state, and that's not the function of the British courts, and nor should it be.
I mean, Murad, would you say that one of the differences here, we've been discussing the parallels with Germany, was, of course, the Nazi state ceased to exist in 1945, so nobody could pursue it. But had it, presumably it would have been, I mean, logically.
Yes, and indeed, that certainly would be the case. And there were more political pressure, of course, here in the United Kingdom. I think we came quite late to the Mau Mau struggle and what was involved there. And it does, as you've seen, need an effective lobbying entity, whatever that may be, in Britain, to be able to mobilise that support and that interest. I mean, I'm only sorry this wasn't pursued earlier, soon after independence.
I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave the discussion, because that's all we've got time for. I hope that you found this an enlightening look back at the 1950s and its impact still on people living today. Join us for the second part, Politics and Media programme, in just a few moments.